In the early 16th century, shiploads of Spanish adventurers crossed the Atlantic to plunder the riches of the New World. The conquistadors were tantalized by one rumor above all others, that there existed a secret Indian city made entirely of gold, a city called El Dorado. In their lust for the golden prize, the Spaniards drove deep into the jungles and high into the mountains of the unexplored continent, encountering worlds that amazed and shocked them. The conquistadors are gone, but the quest for the lost city has never ended. Only now is the truth about El Dorado coming to light. The search at last may be over. For God, for glory, and for gold was the motto of the Spanish conquistadors. Throughout the 1500s, they flooded into Central and South America, taking what pleased them from the native peoples. What pleased them most was gold. Though dazzled by the riches of the New World, the Catholic conquerors were baffled by the Indian way of life. What cultures were these whose armies were commanded by mummified ancestors, whose children were sacrificed to the sun, whose gods were appeased with golden statues? The Indians were equally bewildered by the belligerent and greedy Europeans. What could explain the conquistadors' violent hunger for gold? Perhaps they actually consumed it. More than once, Indians, enraged at their treatment by the invaders, poured molten gold down the throats of captured conquistadors. But the occasional resistance of native populations was no match for Spanish firepower. Region after region fell to the conquerors. Hernando Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire in the 1520s, and Francisco Pizarro dominated the Incas of Peru a decade later, initially looting over 6 tons of Inca gold. As Indian empires were vanquished and their riches plundered, rumors persisted of an even greater prize, a city, even a kingdom, so rich that tufts of grass, when pulled from the ground, had gold dust clinging to their roots. Considering what they'd already found, anything seemed possible, according to historian Michael Francis.
There was a sense that we can discover another Peru. There's so much of this territory that is unknown to us, that there is another kingdom, this great mythical kingdom of gold that we'll uncover. And that inspired groups for decades to launch expedition after expedition to find this place.
The Caribbean port of Cartagena, Colombia, was once the jumping-off point for many of these expeditions. Cartagena was a busy place in the 16th century. Here, looted Indian gold was amassed before being shipped back to Spain, and here, gold-hungry conquistadors disembarked from galleons, eager to seek their fortunes. One expedition that may hold some clues about El Dorado left the Caribbean coast in 1536. Most expeditions to find El Dorado were led by military officers, but this one was headed by a lawyer. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada set off to find a cross-country route to the land of Inca gold. uncharted Magdalena River Valley into the South American interior his journey would take him. Was it somewhere along this route where no Europeans had ever ventured that the Golden City lay hidden? Many of Quesada's soldiers never found out. Within weeks, 3/4 of his force, 600 men, were dead, victims of disease, famine, heat stroke, and Indian attack. In the 16th century world of the conquistador, little time was spent burying the dead. A Spanish chronicler of the period wrote,
"Sometimes a hand clenched in its last agony remained above the ground, seeming to wave farewell to those who went in search of that accursed gold."
Quesada was close to turning back. He had found no gold, certainly no kingdom of gold, and with his force depleted and disheartened, his chances of making it to Peru were growing slim. But a chance encounter with a group of Indians caused Quesada abruptly to change his mind. The Indians were carrying loads of salt and intricately woven cotton blankets, sophisticated goods.
That to them was a clear indication of a civilized society. So when they questioned the Indians about where they acquired such goods, they pointed up towards the mountains to the eastern highlands. So they actually changed their route from following the Magdalena River up into the highlands.
It took Quesada and his bedraggled band months to climb the Andes up to the wild and beautiful highlands, an area of great natural diversity. He called the region New Granada. Much to the Spaniards' surprise, this new land was well cultivated and densely inhabited by a people called the Muisca. The Muisca culture was already 1,000 years old when the Spanish stumbled on it. Were these the people of El Dorado? They certainly used plenty of gold in their rituals. The Muisca culture has long since vanished, and little evidence remains of the world Quesada first encountered. What does exist comes from Spanish chronicles now almost 4 centuries old.
The real tragedy, in a sense, is for this territory, is we don't have written records by the Indians themselves. Everything is seen, interpreted, written, understood through Spanish eyes. But through those eyes, one can get glimpses or hear the faint voices of these Indians.
Colombian anthropologist Carl Langebeck is also fascinated by this lost Indian civilization. He's conducting a complete survey of Muisca territory, trying to understand the complex society the conquistadors first encountered in their relentless pursuit of treasure.
They call this area the area of El Dorado. They found a society that certainly used gold, that was heavily populated in comparison with other societies in Colombia. And they settled down and exploited the local population.
If it is the Muisca who hold the key to El Dorado, there's little indication underfoot. Occasionally, archaeologists do unearth some ancient Muisca pottery or textiles, but most of their world has vanished. The Muisca made things out of perishable materials, which have been reabsorbed by the earth. Once in a while, post holes from long-ruined houses are found, and these, combined with Spanish accounts, can offer an amazing glimpse of 16th century Muisca life. How the region may have looked, with houses of wood or bamboo, their roofs covered with straw or dry leaves. The conquistadors were greatly impressed by the numbers of these huts and by the hustle and bustle of the native villages, so the Spaniards named the people Muisca.
He compared it, in a sense, to bees on a beehive. That there were hamlets, little houses sort of scattered throughout the entire highlands. And they were like flies. And the Spanish word for fly is mosca.
Muisca territory was, for that time and place, densely populated. 500,000 Indians living in an area the size of Holland. The sight must have boosted Quesada's morale. A society as settled and civilized as this surely meant gold. Here was the source of the intricate textiles and salt loaves that had lured the Spaniards off their intended route. As it turned out, the salt may have seemed like gold to the exhausted adventurers. Their own supplies were depleted, forcing them to distill their own urine to produce the vital mineral. The Muisca had mountains of salt, literally. This modern mining tunnel runs deep into a huge hill of rock salt. The Indians used a different technique to extract salt on the hillside above. Here, the Spaniards discovered the Muisca salt works, where briny water bubbling out of the hills was boiled, reduced, and formed into salt loaves easy to transport. After a journey where most of the Indians they had seen wore little or no clothing, the conquistadors must have been impressed by the sophisticated woven mantles worn by the Muisca people. But the gold they lusted after continued to elude them. The dwindling force, now only 170 men, drove southwards. Finally, weeks after first discovering the Muisca civilization, the conquistadors got their first thrilling glimpse of what they were after.
I guess the rooftops, they had bits of gold that dangled down, and when the wind blew, you could hear the wonderful tinkling of the gold, and of course they were seduced by all of this and thought it was the most remarkable thing they'd ever seen. Here's another Peru, we've discovered another golden city.
At last, promising evidence that the riches the Spaniards were seeking might really exist. If these Indians used gold to decorate their huts, surely there was much more to be found. Quesada and his men were not disappointed. Deep in Muisca territory, the conquistadors found themselves surrounded by beautiful golden objects. Was this the fabled kingdom of gold? Few examples of Muisca gold work survive. The Spaniards routinely melted down everything they found and carried it off. From what does remain, it's clear the Muisca didn't just possess gold, they were extremely skilled at working it.
The marvelous thing is that it's so fine that even nowadays it's very difficult or impossible to make a piece so thin.
Astonishing not only to the Spaniards, but even today, the Muisca had developed and mastered almost all the gold-working techniques being used back in Renaissance Europe. Their specialty was a difficult lost wax process in which an object is shaped out of wax, then encased in clay. When the wax is melted, it leaves a cavity into which molten gold is poured. The technique wasn't just used to make jewelry. The Indians created other, more unusual objects. In these figurines, known as tunjos, the Muisca world was captured in gold. These small trinkets must have whetted Spanish appetites for treasure. But the conquistadors paid no attention to what the tunjos revealed about Muisca culture. If they had, the clues might have led them straight to El Dorado. There are hammocks, children, Muisca priests, golden chieftains carried on litters and surrounded by fences. There are Muisca warriors.
In this figure you can see the headdress, you can see the ornaments they would wear hanging from their cheeks, and the necklaces and pectorals they would wear.
Muisca also made gold replicas of the arrow-slinging missile launchers they used to try to halt the advance of the gold-crazed conquistadors. But there was never any real contest. The Spanish plunderers pushed on, taking what they pleased, looking always for more Indian gold, and for El Dorado. In the southern heartland of Muisca territory, at the seat of a powerful local leader, Quesada founded Santa Fe de Bogota. 4 centuries later, Bogota is a city of 8 million people and the capital of Colombia. The valley in which this modern metropolis lies was already home to an impressive Muisca settlement when Quesada arrived. The Spaniard described finding magnificent buildings, palaces of wood. No matter how golden its promise, Bogota was not El Dorado. And most of what gold had been there was spirited away by the local Muisca chieftain before Quesada arrived. Frustrated, but driven on by fresh rumors of a greater source of gold, Quesada headed north once again. He attacked and looted Tunja, another chieftain's capital, then moved on to Sogamosa, the most sacred city of the Muisca people. The Conqueror's Chronicles describe finding one of the largest buildings in the territory, the Muisca's Temple of the Sun, domain of high priests. Few ordinary Muisca would have ever entered this place, fearing a curse would befall them. Not that stopped the conquistadors. And here, as they dreamed, was gold. Gold that was clearly central to the Muisca's sacred world. Gold which the conquistadors began to loot, seizing jewelry that adorned rows of mummies seated around the walls, tearing off thick golden plates that clad the wooden columns. As they plundered the Muisca treasures, the Spaniards' torches set the Indian temple ablaze, burning it to the ground. The pillaging expedition after Bogota netted Quesada's force enough gold to form a pile the size of a mounted horseman. From Tunja alone, he looted gold worth nearly $6 million on today's market. But it wasn't enough. Where was the city of gold? And where was the source of the golden ore?
They did collect an incredible amount of gold. And the view from the archival evidence for a couple of decades was that there are mines in this region. We just have to find them.
The search for El Dorado now included a quest to find the Indians' gold mines. Quesada did succeed in discovering mines that are in operation to this day. These were not the mines he was expecting to find, but emerald mines. One chronicler captures the conquistadors' delight.
For up to then, there had been many opinions in the world concerning emeralds, but no Christian or infidel prince was known to have such a thing as an emerald mine.
The Spaniards watched in fascination as skilled Muisca miners pried huge emeralds loose from the rock face with long sticks and flushed them out with a system of water channels. A process like the one still used today by those who scavenge slag heaps, searching for emeralds modern miners may have overlooked. After discovering the source of the Muisca emeralds, the conquistadors continued to hunt for gold mines. But slowly, it began to dawn on some Spaniards that although they'd spared no effort hunting for the source of the Muisca's gold, they'd been looking in the wrong place. The emeralds had been a clue, because they, along with salt loaves and cotton, were part of a system the Muisca had developed to acquire their gold. A system familiar to the Spanish, but at the time unique among South American peoples. Markets.
The chroniclers from the very beginning celebrate how successful, how skillful these people are in terms of exchange as merchants. And one, in fact, argued that their utmost happiness is found in exchanging goods. I mean, these are not a warlike people. They're happiest when they're trading.
This modern market has its origins back before the Spanish conquest. And here are clues not only to the source of the Muisca's gold, but insights into the people themselves.
They were described by the Spanish conquerors as dark, short people, although not as dark as other Native American societies, with straight black hair and black eyes. Women were described by the Spanish conquerors as extremely beautiful.
Here, the descendants of the Muisca are clearly visible. For although the Spanish conquest had destroyed their culture, the Muisca's physical characteristics have lived on. In markets like this one, 4.5 centuries ago, the Spaniards would have observed a range of produce completely unknown to them. There would have been items such as seashells and dried fish, which had been traded from as far away as the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. And here also the Spaniards would have seen gold, but not gold from Muisca mines. It finally dawned on the conquistadors that the Muisca got their gold through trade. It was panned by neighbors in the valleys of the Magdalena River, 60 miles to the west. That the Muisca got their gold through trade meant that it was a limited resource, a far cry from the conquistadors' vision of a golden kingdom. Even after Quesada's finding, the idea that unlimited riches could be found in the lands around Bogota refused to die. What kept the dream of El Dorado alive here? The answer can be found in Spanish chronicles from the 16th and 17th centuries. For in these accounts, the vision of a golden kingdom has a strange new emphasis. The legend of El Dorado first appears in written form in the work of historian Fernando de Oviedo. Writing in 1541, 4 years after Quesada's conquest of Muisca territory, Oviedo records the tales he's been told. For the first time, the story is not just about a kingdom, but a king.
The Indians say that this chief is a very rich and great ruler. He anoints himself every morning with a certain gum or resin that sticks very well. Powdered gold adheres to that unction until his entire body is covered from the soles of his feet to his head. He looks as resplendent as a gold object worked by the hand of a great artist. I believe that if the chief does do this, he must have very rich mines of fine quality gold.
No one knows what Oviedo's sources were, but El Dorado from then on was linked to a person as well as a place. If the golden chief could be found, there would be his golden city. One costly expedition after another set off in search of the prize. Quesada himself mounted another disastrous campaign in 1569, in which 1,500 Spanish soldiers and Indian porters met their deaths. 10 years later, almost 80 years old, Quesada died without realizing his dream. Almost a half-century later, Spanish chronicles make clear that a new generation of conquistadors still didn't know where to look. If the key to finding El Dorado was finding its golden chief, then an Indian ritual involving that chief might have pointed the way to the gold.
There is a lake in the land of this chief, onto which, placed in the middle of a well-made raft, he went a few times a year. He went naked, but his body was covered from head to hand with sticky turpentine, on which much fine gold dust was scattered.
So the Golden Chief of El Dorado reappears in a chronicle written 80 years after Oviedo's. In this telling, the chief is not only covered in gold, but he and Indians standing around the lake throw gold and emeralds into the water. Finally, the chief himself dives in, completing the ceremony. This ritual takes place at Guatavita, a highland lake in the heart of Muisca territory, just 30 miles east of Bogota. Were there vast amounts of gold at the bottom of Guatavita? The hunt for El Dorado's wealth was back on, with the lake as its new focus. Now Guatavita is a quiet, peaceful place, but that wasn't always the case. A new breed of treasure hunter, whose obsessive drive to find the gold of El Dorado may have exceeded that of the conquistadors, now entered the picture. The first of these was an early settler of Bogota, a wine merchant named Antonio de Sepulveda. He attempted to drain the lake in the 1580s. The human toll was horrific. Sepulveda ordered 8,000 Indians to dig an ever deeper trench. It worked, for a while, actually lowering the water level by 65 feet. But then the trench collapsed, killing many of his workers. Sepulveda died bankrupt. He was buried in the shadow of Guatavita's hills. The disastrous scheme didn't stop other adventurers. For nearly 400 years, Guatavita was subjected to digging, diving, and drilling. The odd piece of gold was found, never enough to make anyone rich, but just enough to keep the dream alive. In 1904, a British company attempted to drain the lake using sluice gates and filters. This time it worked, but the layer of mud on the lake bottom was too soft to walk on. A day later, it had dried to the consistency of concrete. By the time the workers returned with drilling equipment, the lake had refilled. This project, too, was abandoned. In 1965, after several other failed attempts, the Colombian government finally declared that Guatavita should be left in peace. Any further exploration was banned. Guatavita had offered no firm evidence that the Golden Chief and his treasure ritual were real. It seemed the trail of El Dorado had gone cold. Again. Then, in 1969, a cave in the highlands south of Bogota yielded something extraordinary. A golden raft and, at its center, a magnificent golden chieftain. He's surrounded by attendants wearing regal headdresses and ceremonial masks. They all face forward, apparently involved in an important ritual. On the heels of this discovery, a second similar raft was found, also in Muisca territory. Here, at last, tangible evidence to substantiate the chronicler's accounts. There does seem to have been reality behind the rumors. The Golden Chief of El Dorado did once exist, after all. But what of his gold? Answers may lie in Muisca's lost world of myth and magic. Villa de Leyva is a small colonial town in the north of Muisca territory. Founded shortly after Spanish settlers arrived in this area, it appears untouched by the intervening centuries. On the outskirts of Villa de Leyva is a sun-blasted area of desert called Infiernito, the Inferno. Here are the remains of a unique Muisca ritual site, a strange collection of standing stones. There's not much of it left today. Its purpose is a mystery, and Spanish sources are silent about it. It seems to have been abandoned before they arrived. From today's ruin, it's hard to imagine how much effort the Muisca would have put into erecting this site. But by assembling all available evidence and rebuilding it in a virtual way, the scale of the structure can be appreciated. Why was this place built? What rituals were performed here? And what clues does it hold about the whereabouts of El Dorado's gold? The most likely theory suggests Infiernito was a ceremonial center built to worship the moon, the stars, or the sun. Many ancient peoples revered the heavenly bodies as gods. From Spanish accounts, it seems the Muisca were no different.
The Spaniards clearly stated that the Muisca worshipped the sun. But we also know from the importance of the sun from the language. The word for sun, su, is everywhere.
The Muisca's holiest shrine at Sogamosa, the one the Spaniards burnt down, was dedicated to the sun, and in that temple were vast amounts of gold. Could it be that the Muisca saw the power of the sun deity in their golden objects? British anthropologist Nick Saunders believes this to be the case.
In many ways, gold represented the solar power, the spiritual essence of the sun, the color of the sun, the fertilizing rays of the sun were reflected and held in this concretization of power which was the golden object for Muisca.
The exact connection between Infiernito and the sun may remain a mystery, but this site does suggest a link between the sun and the Muisca's use of gold, a link that involves fertility. Some of the stone columns at Infiernito appear to represent giant phalluses. Archaeological evidence dates Infiernito's construction around 800 AD, when agriculture and agricultural fertility were becoming increasingly important to the Muisca. Could it be this need for fertility that determined the Muisca's attitude towards their gold and their gods?
What is important in Muisca religion was that there is some degree of human responsibility with the gods to keep nature working. They thought that humans had to put a lot of effort for that to happen. And that, of course, implied sacrifices and many other ways of returning energy to nature and to the gods.
One of the most startling ways the Muisca returned energy to their gods was through human sacrifices. A gold tuno depicts one form of Muisca sacrifice. A young boy, raised especially for this purpose, was placed atop a pole and darts were fired at him. The boy's blood, collected in a bowl, was then presented to the sun. Small children were also offered up during the construction of important buildings. They were placed in empty post holes and sacrificed when the posts were lowered in on top of them.
The single most important offering that one can make is human sacrifice. Wherever the soul is located in the human society concerned, this can be regenerated, recycled to feed the gods, for the gods themselves to gain succor and strength from this offering, and therefore to reinforce human life on earth.
The human sacrifices of the Muisca, grisly though they seem, were relatively rare compared to other Native American cultures, like the Aztecs. To the Muisca, a far more common offering was gold. What they did with their gold was unique among South American Indians. They gave it away as gifts to the gods. Spanish accounts reveal how the golden offerings were made.
They were placed in jars made of pottery and ill-proportioned, open at the top, in which they put golden jewels, animals, and figures. They closed the opening with a lid of clay, and when these were full, they buried them in a sacred place.
The sacred places in which the offerings were hidden were scattered across Muisca territory. Many were shrines called kukas, which were almost always in natural surroundings.
These Indians are great idolaters, and any riches they manage to acquire are then offered to their secret sanctuaries, all of which are well concealed.
One sees indications of offerings actually buried in the fields. Caves became very important. The top of hilltops. Forests. It infuriated the Spaniards because they had such difficulty finding the sanctuaries because they were everywhere.
The Spaniards' obsession with gold meant they spared no effort attempting to locate and loot these sacred sites. 4 centuries later, these places are unlikely to yield more treasure, but they do provide insight into the Muisca's attitude towards gold.
We might think that it's particularly strange to throw away gold as part of an offering, but that's because we're looking at it from westernized, a compartmentalized view of the universe. From an indigenous perspective, it's offering essence and strength back to the natural world, back to the land where the spirits grab hold of it and recycle it and regenerate it for continued life on earth.
The Muisca's sacred world is beginning to offer up clues that point to El Dorado's gold. But were there still other locations where the Muisca left offerings to their gods? There were, in burial sites. Like the Muisca Temple of the Sun, these burial sites would contain the mummified remains of the elite of Muisca society, mummies that had been dehydrated over a fire. Some were left intact, but others had had their internal organs removed. Anthropologist Felipe Cardenas Arroyo is an expert on Muisca mummies and on the reason for the eviscerations.
You can find a mummy with the offerings inside the mummy, an eviscerated body with emeralds, with gold, with cotton objects, with stone objects, which were all offerings.
This isn't the only indication that the Muisca had a peculiar relationship with their ancestors.
The Spanish would tell us that when they went into battle, the Muiscas went into battle, they would carry the mummified bodies of their chiefs. So that is a very strong symbolism of political power.
The power vested in the mummies and their connection with offerings reveals that the Muisca's attitude towards death was very different than the conquistadors.
They believe that ancestors will live on, that the reason that they preserve the body is to negate death. There is really no death in their concept.
Could it be here, in the Muisca view of their ancestors, that more clues about El Dorado's whereabouts might be found?
For us in the West, there's a firm boundary between the spiritual world and the physical world. The physical world is the real world of everyday life. Spiritual world is something completely different. For the Muisca and all indigenous South American peoples, it's completely the other way round. The physical life is the illusion, and the spiritual life is where all power and all influence and all fertility comes from. So that's the reality that they're mostly concerned with.
These revelations add a strange new twist to the quest for El Dorado. A diversion into the uncharted territory of Muisca beliefs, to the border between their material and spiritual worlds. But how can we go deeper into a long-dead people's perception of reality? Here again, Muisca gold and pottery tell a story in strange and wonderful pictures. Men in a distinctive sitting posture, small bowls clutched by priests, images of birds. These are evidence for a custom that was, and still is, widespread in indigenous cultures around the world: shamanism. In this religious practice, people enter a trance-like state, often with the aid of consciousness-enhancing drugs. Gold and shamanism? The connection is in the hallucinations. These small pots are poporos, used by the Muisca elite to mix coca leaves with lime, which would then be chewed, often as a precursor to taking more mind-altering drugs. The drugs were sometimes derived from the bark of trees, ground and drunk with water. Other times, plant seeds were taken as snuff. During the ritual, the squatting shaman is in an intense state of concentration, focusing on his visions. Muisca gold work links images of shamans with those of birds. Under the influence of hallucinogens, Muisca shamans perceive themselves as flying to the spiritual world. Here they could communicate with spiritual beings, allowing them to foretell the future, ward off evil magic, and acquire cures for disease. There's even more to these experiences. The link between shamanism and El Dorado's gold emerges in the mysterious rock art that dots the Muisca landscape. Here are sacred designs, the same ones that are echoed in Muisca pottery and textiles.
We believe that some of the designs are the product of the first stages of hallucination. Hallucinations have different stages, and the first stages, a series of light patterns appear before the true hallucinations happen. And those light patterns seem to be what we are finding in these designs, whether it's rock art or in pottery.
As hallucinating shamans undertook their flights to the spirit world, they perceived themselves as becoming bright and entering a world of blinding brightness. The sensation was described by a 17th century Spanish chronicler: a Muisca shaman's drug trip seen through the filter of Catholicism.
The shaman was so close to the devil that he used to take him up in the air, and the Indians said that nothing was more terrifying than to see the moon so big that it appeared 5 times larger than from the earth when you were up in the air and close to it.
The Muisca's views of life and of gold appear to have been shaped by connecting their spirit world with these bright hallucinogenic experiences. Anything that was bright or shiny could be seen as evidence of the sacred spilling over into the material.
Indigenous societies saw brightness in almost every aspect of the natural world. They could see it in the sun, the moon, rock crystals, gold, seashells, and grains of sand or salt. It didn't really matter what the object was, in one sense. It was the shininess, the resonance of the object which was the important thing.
Muisca shared these beliefs, and it appears they did, then gold would have been just one of a number of bright and shining objects that had value, and the value would not have been material, but spiritual. There's other evidence that bears this out in Muisca mythology. In one creation story, recorded in the Chronicles, blackbirds breathe fire, from which the sun is created. A story in which the images of birds and brightness are clearly shamanic. Yet another Muisca creation myth finally brings El Dorado within our grasp.
It was told that when the light created by the Creator, Chimenagua, fell on a sacred lake, there emerged from the waters Bashwe. With her she brought a young boy, whom when he grew up she married. And on their travels together, they peopled the entire earth. In her old age, she turned herself and her consort into water serpents, and returned to her lake.
This myth reflects the Muisca view that of their sacred places, some were more sacred than others, especially highland lakes. From the Muisca's shamanic perspective, it's possible to understand the significance of lakes.
They can be looked at as spiritual entrances to the underworld. Their shiny, glittering surfaces are like mirrors. They reflect light, and if you put objects underneath or you go underneath the water, it's entering the spirit realm.
So the search for El Dorado's gold returns to the sacred lakes of the Muisca and to the golden chieftain at the heart of the legend. Now the Muisca ritual becomes a revelation.
There are a number of different ways one can look at it and break it down into different levels. First of all, the individual himself was coated in bright, shiny resin, which made him very, very similar in some ways to the shaman who becomes translucent with spiritual power. On top of that, he was covered with flecks of gold, little pieces of heaven made manifest, concretizations of spiritual power. He then entered the water and broke the surface of the boundary between this world and the spirit world by passing through the shiny mirrored surface into the underworld, the subterranean watery world below, the source of fertility, the source of bright spirituality and power.
Here at last is the gold of El Dorado, which literally translated means golden one. For El Dorado is the name of the golden man, and the gold of El Dorado, the shiny dust on his body. The ritual has nothing to do with material wealth, but contact between worlds, seen and unseen. How completely Quesada and the Spanish gold hunters missed the point. To them, a chief covered in gold could symbolize nothing but a sign of great riches. So the legend of El Dorado's Golden Kingdom was born, out of misunderstanding. A product of the culture clash between two worlds, the old and the new, and their vastly different perceptions of the meaning of gold. A costly mistake for all concerned. The Spaniards not only brought their violence and greed into Muisca territory, they brought old world diseases to which the Indians had no resistance. From a population estimated at over 500,000, it fell to less than 100,000 in a mere century. Slowly but surely, the Muisca civilization slipped into oblivion, leaving behind a great and enduring mystery. Where was the lost city of gold? Where was El Dorado? No one knew to ask, who was El Dorado? Until now. One of the longest treasure hunts in history can finally be called off.